Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture, brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
Welcome to the Table, where we discuss issues of God and culture. I'm Darrell, Bock, Executive Director for Cultural Engagement at the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary. And our topic today is Christian ethics, particularly issues associated with death and dying. And my expert is a good friend of mine, Scott Ray, Dr. Scott Ray, who teaches out at Talbot Seminary and is Dean of Faculty there. Have I sufficiently introduced you, Scott?
That's good enough.
Okay. A little disclaimer here at the start. Scott and I have known each other for a very, very long time. We grew up down the street from one another, known each other since we were 5 years old. We're literally childhood friends who know far more about each other than we ought to. But Scott has developed his expertise, particularly in the area of Christian ethics, and has written a book that's just come out called Introducing Christian Ethics, one of several that he's written on moral choices. In fact, the subtitle of this is A Short Guide to Making Moral Choices. So, Scott, why don't you tell everybody how you got in the field of Christian ethics?
Well, I started more in the sort of traditional seminary route, and did Old Testament, and then transitioned into ethics. I remember speaking to a provost at another university, and he asked me, "How did you get from Old Testament into ethics?" And I looked at him straightforwardly and said, "I read the text."
Mm-hmm.
I took the Old Testament text seriously. I don't think you can read the Scripture very long without having an interest in ethics, what Roman Catholics call moral theology. What I wanted to do, what I was most interested in, is doing some field where I could connect my background in Bible and theology to issues that people actually cared about and were reading on the front page of the newspaper. Because what I had found was that the people who were really good in biblical studies and theology were not so good on the issues of the day. And vice versa. The people who were good on the issues, if they even cared about biblical studies and theology, tended to play it fast and loose with the Scripture. So I want to try and do both of those well and bring those together and speak to issues that I still think desperately need a coherent, biblically based, theologically sound position.
Yeah, we talk about it here this way. We say that seminaries do a pretty good job, generally speaking, of trying to train people to go from the Bible to life. But when you switch it and go from life back to the Bible, that's a little harder move. It's a little more difficult move, complicated move. And as a result, people tend not to do that as well. And seminaries don't do quite as good a job at training people to go in that direction as they ought to.
Well, sort of. I mean, I agree. It's too bad that that's a shortcoming because, as you and I've talked about, that's actually the way the Bible tends to approach it.
Exactly right.
Starting from life, and then going back to what's necessary and to be well grounded biblically and theologically.
And of course, what makes that challenging is that when you move from life back to the Bible, we'll stay talking about a little method here before we get into the specific topic. But when you move from life to the Bible, you have to deal with the whole of the Bible in many ways, as opposed to this passage or that passage. And it's too easy in discussing ethics in the Bible to cherry pick from passages rather than being holistic in how you put that package together. Is fair summary?
I think that is a fair summary, and where I think we really benefit from seeing the whole picture is if we can give people the full four-chapter, what I call the four-chapter view of biblical history, where we go, we're good at giving them fall and redemption, but not so much at creation and consummation.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Those are the bookends are the part that I think is missing from a lot of theological education.
Yeah, we talk about this in relationship to the gospel all the time, that the gospel doesn't start in Genesis 3, it starts in Genesis 1. We're made for relationship with God. We're made in the image of God. We're made to be connected to God. And when we start with the fall and we forget that starting point, we forget God's commitment to be related to us, or we risk forgetting God's commitment to be related to us from the very beginning. And the consummation, of course, takes you back to that starting point, so that it wraps the story of the tensions the fall introduces around a prequel, if you will, that says God made us to be good creatures who are to be connected to Him.
Right, and that's why I think we would suggest that our salvation is for the life of the world, not just for our own personal eternal life.
That's right.
So that's what I think the bookends give us that is so important.
So we push towards a set of values that push in the direction of seeking common good in the best sense of that phrase, and seeking human flourishing in the best sense of that phrase. And we are also taught to think beyond ourselves and our own individual lives to what's going on with people around us and the creation around us, etc.
Yeah, and I think I put it in terms of how Jeremiah spoke to the exiles, where even though Israel was in exile in Babylon, they were still commanded to seek the welfare of the city that they were in, seek the welfare of the common good. And I think in our culture today, with the church, I think more resembling being in exile today than it has at any other time in my lifetime. I think that's still good advice from Jeremiah.
Yeah, the other image that we often put forward as we're thinking about this is that we're called to be ambassadors for Christ. We are representatives of the kingdom of heaven in such a way that how we interact, even how we engage with conflict and tension, is to reflect the way in which God has done it. And God takes the initiative of stepping into that tension through the incarnation with Christ, and to show how He is taking the initiative to try and defuse situations as opposed to contribute to the tension.
Well, I think that's why this material on the end of life matters so much. Not just because it's the doorstep to eternity, but because the body matters. So if the incarnation tells us anything, it's that the body counts, and it counts for eternity. And that's why I think it's so important that we get this right about how to care for people at the end of life.
Well, one more question before we transition to that discussion specifically, and that's this: as we think about, sometimes the question gets asked this way: how can we talk about the common good when we hold so little in common and we can't agree on what's good? How do you do that in a world where there are so many different ideas out there about what the common good is? How do you build those bridges?
Well, can we take the rest of the time on that?
Yeah.
But I guess I'd quibble with the premise a bit on this, because I think sometimes when we acknowledge the moral diversity culturally, we forget about all the areas in which there is moral common ground. I think if we had as much moral diversity as we sometimes think we do, our culture, we wouldn't be able to survive on a day-to-day basis. But the very fact that we have meaningful communication, that we have mostly trustworthy market-based transactions, that we drive our cars at 60 to 70 miles an hour without killing or maiming each other on a daily basis, and among a number of other things, suggests that there's actually, I think, a little deeper reservoir of shared values than we are wont to admit. And I think I'd want to be careful, too, to distinguish between disagreement in terms of values and a difference in application. Because I think there are values, I think, that are widely shared, but the application of those can look pretty different in different cultures. And I'm not sure I'd call that an example of moral diversity. I'd call that an example of, I guess, applicational diversity. But I think we probably have a little more in common than we give ourselves credit for. In some parts of the world, that may be less true than others.
It's interesting, because I do think that you're right, that if you ask what motivates people to act as they do, actually the way I describe this is that there are tensions, that you've got competing biblical values sometimes because we live in a fallen world that come against one another, and what people are debating is not this tension or that tension, but how to balance those two in relationship to each other a lot of times.
No, that's a good observation. We tell this to our business students all the time. We said, in a fallen world, don't be surprised that you have genuine moral conflicts. And that's a moral conflict is when biblical values come into conflict. And I don't think, in fact, I'm surprised that it doesn't happen more often. And so what the debate is often over how you weight competing values and for what reasons. And trusting more than just your gut or your intuition.
And the hard thing here is that what tends to happen in our rhetoric that gets in the way is that people will they'll cherry pick those values and land on one almost at the expense of the other, and in the process cut off the conversation that needs to be had about how to balance the things that are in tension.
That's right. This is why we say, for the most part, even though the way we view morality in general is predominantly through a blend of virtues and principles, we would call ourselves a prima facie absolutist or prima facie principle driven. And that's Latin for at first face or at first glance, which suggests that the things that we consider moral absolutes are generally absolute, but calling them prima facie leaves room for there to be exceptions to those when they come into conflict with other competing values. For example, we say truth-telling is a prima facie moral value, but if somebody comes knocking on the door for the Table podcast and says, "Where's the host?" pointing a loaded gun, I hope that your staff person is going to tell them something that will mislead them.
Like he's occupied.
Well, I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't stretch that too far. But I think we would all say that there are times in which the obligation to tell the truth conflicts with some other important value that may or may not be weighted more heavily.
So, I mean, you tell that story, and I immediately think of the way in which the Gentile woman hid the Israelite spies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or take, when the Gestapo knocked on Corrie ten Boom's door in World War II and said, "Are you hiding Jews?" Which she was. And if she had told the truth there, they would have been shipped off to Auschwitz. And I think she did not just a lesser evil. I actually think she did a morally justifiable thing.
Interesting. Well, we're probably due for another podcast that's just about how to make these moral choices and pursue the common good and that kind of thing. But I think it's important to kind of set the table for what we're getting ready to discuss, because there's no doubt that when you come into the area of assisted suicide and death and the expectations tied to that you're dealing in some senses with really competing values that people are appealing to as they go through these options. And Scott, what struck me about the chapter that you wrote, and we're looking at chapter 8 in this book, Death, Dying, and Assisted Suicide, is a distinction you make early on that I'd like you to elaborate on a little bit between the three levels of conversation that you need to think about as you talk about end of life. The difference between withdrawing treatment, between what's called PAS, or I guess physician-assisted suicide, and then termination of life support, or what you call TLS. I know something's important when it gets an abbreviation and it's all in caps. So talk a little bit about the difference of those three levels and why it's important for this kind of a discussion.
Yeah. In fact, I think the trickiest conversations are not around assisted suicide. Mm-hmm. They're around the termination of life support.
Yes.
And I think those are the things that cause families and loved ones the most angst at the end of life. So termination of life support is simply exercising what I think is a person's biblically allowed option under the right conditions to say stop to medicine. Mm-hmm. And to say enough. And I actually think it's a way of entrusting the patient back to the Lord by removing all medical obstacles that prevent the disease from taking its natural course. So it's the cause of death when a life support is removed or treatment is stopped or withheld is the underlying disease or condition that's allowed to run its natural course.
Because it's killing the person.
Right.
Yeah.
And generally because continuing to treat the person is under if the prognosis is very poor at the end of life, continuing to treat the person is either futile, which means it's not going to stop this irreversible downward spiral toward death, or more commonly, it's more burdensome than beneficial to the patient. Because most treatments are at least moderately beneficial. But the problem is that they impose such burdens on the patient. For example, I spent about 15 years as an ethics consultant for various hospitals around the Southern California area. And I'll never forget one case where this 98-year-old man, he couldn't have weighed more than about 98 pounds. He was at the end stage of stomach and colorectal cancer. His family was requesting that he be prepped for a colonoscopy, God forbid, to enable one last round of radiation treatment to try and get him to live a little bit longer. The nurses brought the case to the ethics committee. You know what they said? They said, "Why are we torturing this poor man?" In fact, I think you probably could have held him up to a nice, strong, bright light and been able to see about as much as you could from a colonoscopy. He was so thin. But I think that what they recognized is that the potential benefit of this treatment was just vastly outweighed by the burden that it was causing to this poor man, whose family, I think, were good-hearted, but the family, they weren't in the room. They weren't watching what was going to go on. They went out for lunch after they authorized this without a clue about what they were actually authorizing medicine to do to their loved one. I think under that condition especially, I think it would have been not only appropriate, but I think it was their obligation to say enough to medicine. And the treatment would now, they transition to what's called palliative care or just pain control only.
Yeah, I think you and I have both been through these kinds of decisions personally. I remember, and this is actually interesting, I actually remember my wife's grandmother going through after a stroke and slowly going downhill, getting to the point where her family was put in the position of having to make this decision. Interestingly enough, her father, a very well-known doctor, facing these decisions all the time, and they were getting down to this kind of level of care. And it's the only time they've consulted me on something moral. And they came to me and said, here are the choices. We've got a disagreement between the doctor who's caring for this woman and my father-in-law as a doctor, and they were asking me for an opinion about the withdrawal of care. And basically, the response that I gave them was very much like yours. It's asking the question, what real good is this going to do to extend this care? What kind of prognosis do we really have? That kind of thing. There comes a point where you say, this disease, in a sense, has won, and let it run its course.
That's right. See, I think I'd say a prior question we encourage family members to ask themselves is, if this patient could speak for himself or herself, would they want this additional treatment? And so we use in bioethics, the term we use for that is substituted judgment, where you substitute your own judgment representing as best you can what you think the wishes of that patient might be, which is another good reason why all of us ought to be writing these things down.
Yes, so I was just going to come. Most of you get this consent ahead of time. Yeah. And
so then it becomes a lot simpler, because the family's role then, if they have something in writing, the family's role is simply interpretive. They get to, or I'm sorry, not interpretive, it's enforcement. It's because the family's function is not a hermeneutical one.
Right.
They don't get to reinterpret and come up with a better idea.
Yeah.
Their job, the patient they've done their homework and written this down because they take it seriously. And they expect that those things be followed, particularly by their family members. But that's not always the case.
Yeah. Now, this introduces an element into the conversation that probably is going to run us up into the break, and we're going to have to cover on the other side. But obviously, when we're dealing with the desire of the patient, we're running up against another standard that is driving this discussion, and that is the preciousness of life and who gets to make choices about the precious nature of life. And so when those come into conflict, you're sliding, if you will, you might be sliding away from dealing with terminal care, if I can characterize this first category that way, to the idea of physician-assisted death, and we're moving across a track here that it becomes more complicated morally.
I think that's right. And with the termination of treatment, the reason I don't think that you have a genuine moral conflict, although emotionally you have a huge one, is because the notion of death being a conquered enemy, I think strongly suggests that it need not always be resisted. And that we are not obligated to keep everybody alive at all times and at all costs, no matter what. I think that's forcing us to make a theological statement that I really don't think we want to make, because if we are obligated to keep everyone alive at all times and at all costs, then I think what we're saying theologically is that earthly life is the highest good. Which theologically, that's not true. Earthly life is a penultimate good. Now, it's pretty high up the list, but it's not at the top of the pile. I think Augustine was right when he said our highest good is our eternal fellowship with God.
So part of what you do in this chapter is to talk about the biblical background to the idea that life is precious and that we need to understand kind of what that ranking is, if I can use a picture. That's what you're getting at here, right?
I think so, yeah. And I think you can hold to the sacredness of life without it becoming an idol. And I think the term we use for the notion you have to keep everybody alive at all times and all costs is vitalism. And the Bible does not teach vitalism. The sanctity of life and vitalism are not the same thing. Because although I think what the sanctity of life suggests is that what violates the sixth commandment, which is human beings cannot deliberately be the cause of death for another innocent human being, including themselves. But it doesn't follow that we can let go of medical treatment so that the cause of death is allowed to be the underlying disease or condition. Those are two very different things, morally and philosophically.
And now we're coming to physician-assisted suicide and the rest of the spectrum in terms of taking life. And I think the way I want to introduce this segment is to talk about the way in which this has gotten portrayed in our culture. It's kind of setting the table for this conversation. And we've been through, in recent times, 2 movies that have portrayed this. And I'd like for Scott to kind of walk us through these 2 movies and what they put out on the table and how we should think about them.
Yeah. Can I go back for 10 seconds?
Absolutely.
Just to be clear, I wouldn't want your readers to think that, or your listeners to think that the termination of care is ever an option. That's why we always try to use the term termination of treatment.
Okay.
Because care is always morally obligated, regardless of decisions about treatment. So what we do is we transition a person from aggressive care to palliative care or pain relief care. So, I've had to talk to physicians about this, and nurses not so much, but to say, we're not ending care, we're ending treatment. So that's, I think, an important distinction, especially for pastors and for family members who are at the bedside. It's really important that they be reassured that their loved one, even though we may terminate treatment, that they're still going to be cared for and their dignity is still going to be protected. A few years ago, Million Dollar Baby came out, which was advertised as a boxing movie, but in reality, it was an assisted suicide movie that I think fairly aggressively advocated for assisted suicide. And it was illegal at the time, so it wasn't really an option. But Hilary Duff plays a boxer who's coached by Clint Eastwood. And after years of boxing and the injuries involved, came to a place where she wanted to end her life. And it was viewed in the movie as sort of tragic that the law at the time was preventing her from doing that. Contrast that I think, to the movie, which is the more recent one that I think this podcast is going to be released about
Me
the time
Before
it comes
You.
out.
Yep.
Me Before You,
Mm-hmm.
which is a great story about the value of life of the disabled, the seriously disabled, and the obligation of care for the most vulnerable among us. And I think it illustrates, I think, really well the biblical notion that we are obligated to care and to advocate for the most vulnerable among us, as opposed to considering them the first candidates for assisted suicide.
Okay, so with that in place as kind of the background, let's talk a little bit about what's called PAS, or physician-assisted suicide. How should Christians think about this? And maybe the way into this, Scott, is to talk a little bit about the theology that comes before it. That how should we think about life and death, both, as we think about these situations that oftentimes lead to the injection of the possibility of PAS?
Okay. I think theologically, I think the explanation, the grounding theologically, I think, bumps directly up against the most common argument used for assisted suicide and euthanasia. And that is, it's an argument from personal autonomy. And it's my body, it's my choice, it's my life, it's my decision, it's my death, and morality and the law should just stay out of it. I think the Bible, is really clear about the place that personal autonomy has, and the place that the fulfillment of our desires has in the hierarchy of things that are important to a person who's committed to following Jesus. I find, as I read the New Testament, the idea of the fulfillment of my desires ranks pretty low on the priority list of those things that are important to the people who are committed to following Jesus. I read texts like, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me, which suggests that the satisfaction of my desires is a fairly low priority. Not that my desires are useless, but that they are trumped by a whole lot of other things. I think the reality with assisted suicide, and this is actually very timely in my home state of California here, because as of July 1st, the law that was passed permitting assisted suicide actually went into effect just not even a couple months ago. So, but I think, again, theologically, the mandate to protect innocent life, the mandate for human beings not to be the direct cause of death for another innocent human being, is something that comes from passages like Hebrews 9:28, which suggests it's appointed unto a man to die once, and then comes judgment. Well, it's appointed by whom? Right? Obviously appointed by God, which suggests that God is the one who has the ultimate say in the cause of death for innocent human beings. Or to take the first few bits of Ecclesiastes chapter 3, where there's a time for everything, time to be born and a time to die. The point of that is that life is this grand symphony of which God is the composer. And that the reason there's a time to live and a time to die is because God has set the times to live and the times to die. So I think what that suggests theologically is that the timing and manner of our death ultimately belongs to God. And for the believer, it seems to me that doing an end run around the dying process, I don't find anything particularly dignified about that. In fact, it seems to me that dignity in dying comes from how you cope with all of the necessary losses that are a part of the dying process, and how you endure that with grace, how you endure that with faith and trust. Seems to me that's what it means for a believer to die with dignity. And the reality is that the number of people who actually face the end of their lives in unremitting, unrelieved pain is minusculely small. That's why the argument for mercy, which it makes for a great 30-second soundbite, has largely been abandoned by the advocacy groups that are promoting euthanasia and assisted suicide. And it's focused more on an autonomy argument. And the reality is that medicine, particularly good palliative care medicine, can control almost everyone's pain at the end of life, short of killing them. And what we found is that when people have their pain controlled, it's not a big surprise, but when their pain is under control, they actually give up the desire for assisted suicide.
So I take it here that the idea of assisted suicide, now this is legal in some states now, is that correct? I mean, I think you mentioned California.
Five states in the U.S. Now it's Washington, Oregon, California, Montana, and Vermont.
Oh, so I was going to say it's completely a Northwest thing, and I mean Northwest thing until Vermont came into the mix.
It's not.
Yeah, but it's obviously an ongoing discussion. It's the opposite end of the life discussion in some ways from a perhaps more famous discussion that takes place among Christians related to issues tied to birth, but it's still in many ways a similar kind of conversation about how to view life.
Yeah, it's the other end of the coin at the other end of life.
Mm-hmm. And
in fact, people who said in 1973 that the court's view of abortion would eventually come back to impact how the courts view the end of life has turned out to be exactly true.
Interesting. So where are the courts on this? I mean, like you said, you obviously have served on ethics commissions of hospitals. Where are the courts on these kinds of issues?
Well, the Supreme Court ruled on this definitively in 1997 with a case from the Northwest and a case from New York from the East Coast. And essentially what they ruled is that there's nothing unconstitutional about either allowing or prohibiting assisted suicide. So it left it entirely to the states through the legislative process to come up with whatever they wanted their policy to be on this. And just by the way, that's the primary criticism of Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion. That's what most people who are opposed to abortion think that the court should have done with Roe v. Wade.
Interesting. So distinguish for me between passive or physician. Sorry, I keep calling it passive. Physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. Is there a distinction there?
Yes, and it's actually it's an important one, I think, for the law. Morally, I think, though, it's probably a distinction without much of a difference.
Okay, that's actually what I'm driving at.
Yeah, the assisted suicide, it occurs when a patient has 6 months or less to live with a diagnosable terminal illness, and the physician comes in and prescribes, advises, and supervises the patient ingesting the life-ending dose of medication himself or herself. Right? The patient actually does this with the assistance of the physician.
So the person has made the choice basically to say, I want to terminate my life, and doctor, will you help me do that?
Right. And so it's basically employing doctors so people don't have to shoot themselves.
Right. Okay. All right.
Now, euthanasia generally occurs when the person is too sick or debilitated to commit suicide themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so the physician himself or herself will provide the lethal dose of medication, usually through an IV line. And so there's the direct intentional action of the physician as opposed to the action of the patient that's the cause of death.
So physician-assisted suicide is really the agent making the decision is still the patient himself or herself, and all the physician is the mediator of that decision. Whereas in euthanasia,
the guide on the side.
Okay, and in euthanasia, the physician is making all the calls.
Physician is the active agent. Now, what we need to be clear about is that in some context, in some countries, the physician acts only when the patient gives consent. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, you would think that should be non-negotiable. But what we're learning from 20 to 30 years experience of this in Europe is that roughly somewhere between 15 to 20% of all cases of euthanasia are done without the explicit consent of the patient. In fact, the Dutch actually, this is one of the first places where this was loosely legalized and then formally legalized. The Dutch coined a term for this back in the 80s, calling it crypthanasia, which is euthanasia done cryptically, which generally without the patient's consent, but also most of the time without the patient's knowledge. These are patients in a vegetative state or in severe cases of dementia, things like that. It seems to me once we go down that road, then it's hard not to suggest that these patients are being harmed. Because if they're being put to death either against their will or without their knowledge, that's a line that I think we ought not be crossing. And it seems to me that's an inevitable result of this, because imagine talking to your elderly in-laws, for example, and let's say they're both living, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, let's say Sally's mom is really seriously ill, and she's demented and doesn't really know kind of which end is up, and your father-in-law and you and the kids all come around and start putting pressure on her to sign this assisted suicide declaration. And you eventually wear her down, and she does it not because she's tired of living, but essentially because all of you are tired of her living. And she signs the declaration, assisted suicide is performed, and under one set of ways of looking at this, all's well. Now in California, if that happened, you've just committed a felony. My question is, who will ever know that this has happened? And without intolerable invasions of privacy, nobody will ever become aware that the family has essentially twisted her arm. That
the signature really wasn't hers.
Right. Into signing this, and you've coerced her into doing this. Mm-hmm. This is why way back when this first started being debated, Daniel Callahan, was the head of the Hastings Center, the preeminent bioethics think tank in the world, still said there is no way, even in principle, that the demand that the request for assisted suicide or euthanasia be completely voluntary can be enforced. And that is, I think, a really troubling part of the legalization of this. Now, if I could amplify this just slightly, and this is where we need to take our lesson, not what's from going on in Oregon and Washington, but what's going on in Europe. Because Europe, I submit to you, is about 20 years ahead of where we will be on this.
Not unusual.
They understand that we're facing a demographic landslide, where in the next 20 years, we're going to have record numbers of people like you and me who are going to be over the age of 65. And arguably needing care when it's the most costly to provide it.
Yeah, that actually was going to be my next question, is how much is economics playing into this?
It's huge, especially in Europe. What they're doing, and this is what's so troubling about this, is in Europe now they are explicitly linking the legalization of assisted suicide and euthanasia with controlling this avalanche of costs at the end of life caused by the baby boomers becoming geezer boomers. Mm-hmm. And as a colleague of mine put it some years ago, she said there is nothing cheaper than dead. Right? Now, that's not a great public relations line for assisted suicide, mm-hmm. but there is no mistaking the reality that in Europe, they are explicitly connecting these two, which is forcing some folks who are sort of traditionally, I'd say, pro-abortion and liberal on a variety of causes to oppose assisted suicide because they see what's coming. And that's the really troubling part of making this legal and opening the doors to it across the board. If it's legalized on the basis that everybody has a fundamental right to die, then the other the other point of tension with this is that if it's based on the fundamental right to die, then everybody over the age of 18 should be able to exercise it, and the reason shouldn't matter.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a fundamental right.
And you do understand that there are some forms of medical care that exist today in which procedures that could enhance and prolong life are refused because of the cost that they have and the age of the patient who's asking for the procedure.
That's right. And I don't think that's entirely inappropriate.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because, I mean, I take my dad, for example. He died of this horrible cancer that had started at his feet and ankles and spread to his brain. And he was an MD Anderson, which is the priciest cancer care probably in the world. It's also some of the best.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm convinced that if he knew that his being treated was going to bankrupt my mom, he would have foregone it without a second thought.
Mm-hmm.
And I think rightly so. Now, I want that to be someone's choice. The reason I wouldn't say that's an obligation, because that creates a counterclaim that family members can then exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think that families exercising that claim, I think, is fundamentally incompatible.
Much less a government doing so, right?
No.
Much
What's
less
that?
a government doing so. In other words, having it be mandated as a matter of what happens in Europe is that certain, I think, tables are put into place, if you will, or processes or policies that say if you're over this age with this kind of procedure, with this kind of a condition, then the government, because it subsidizes the medical care, will not pay for the process and for the procedure.
And just for example, some of this is coming home to roost already. There's a handful of cases in Oregon where the insurance company denied the potential life-extending treatment. And granted, the prognosis was poor. They probably should have denied it. But they instead offered to pay for assisted suicide. And don't tell me that that's not a financial inducement that's designed to encourage assisted suicide, precisely because of the financial cost. It's easy to see this now and say, well, we're not in crisis mode. But our healthcare system is going to be in crisis mode probably sometime in the next decade or two, because the system is just not equipped to deal with all of us baby boomers,
growing old,
needing end-of-life care.
Yeah.
Which does not bode well for folks like you and me.
Well, I appreciate you bringing us near the end of this podcast with great news. Let's talk a little bit about euthanasia, which is kind of where, for most people, this discussion starts, but it really is, in many ways, as it has been for us, kind of the last point.
I'd say it's the caboose on the train.
Okay, and what do you how do you think people should think about euthanasia?
I think euthanasia is murder,
mm-hmm.
and it's murder, particularly of the class of people that the Bible calls us to advocate for, which is the marginalized. See, in the Scripture, the figures of speech for the most vulnerable among us were the widow and the orphan. Today, I think those figures of speech ought to be changed to the unborn and the elderly.
In other words, they include those groups because they're among the vulnerable.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think the predominant figures of speech today, widows not so much, orphans probably still true,
mm-hmm.
but we ought to expand that to include the unborn and the elderly.
And your point here is that the principle that the Scripture is talking about is that people who are sensitive to life and what life means and the way God gives it and seeks for it to be managed and the way we're supposed to encourage one another with regard to life should pay special attention to the people who can't advocate for themselves.
Exactly. I mean, the Bible is so clear on the obligation of the people of God to care for the most vulnerable among us. I mean, you can barely read one page of the Scripture without seeing that come out.
Yeah, I mean, the sense of compassion and understanding we're supposed to have about life runs pretty deeply through the Scripture as a commitment of the way we love our neighbor and the way we're supposed to relate to one another in support of people.
And I think that's the really good news about the movie, Me Before You.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I love about the movie, is because people, the main character was somebody who's terribly disabled, clearly fits among the most vulnerable among us. Lots of people in Europe would say that's a clear candidate for euthanasia. Yet what the movie's about is this obligation that was fulfilled by meeting and caring for people that we tend to write off as unimportant and marginalized.
Interesting. Well, Scott, I really do appreciate you taking the time to walk us through this. It's interesting. I was in Australia and New Zealand this summer and was doing a lot of stuff on cultural engagement. And I was in Christchurch in New Zealand, and they said, when you come back, we want you to look at some specific issues for us. And one of the ones that they did was the topic of death, dying, and euthanasia, which is becoming a topic of attention up there. And so I thank you for giving some material to work with when I do this. It's helpful to talk to someone who's spent time thinking about this ethically and theologically, and has also dealt with the practical side of it, being on a hospital board that makes these decisions regularly. So I really do appreciate you coming in and talking to us about it. I think it's an important topic we don't think enough about.
Well, it's my pleasure. I do think it's a crucial one. I've often asked families, who are hanging on to earthly life for their loved one, do you really believe the stuff about eternity that you say you do? And I'd like for us to be able to approach the end of life like we actually believe the stuff about resurrection and eternity.
Well, thank you again, Scott, and we thank you for being a part of the table and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Table Podcast. For more podcasts like this one, visit dts.edu/the table. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.